They were told they were not men. They were told they could not fight, that they lacked the courage, the discipline, the very capacity for organized warfare. This was the lie, repeated in the halls of Congress and whispered in the army barracks. A lie designed to keep nearly 4 million people in chains and a Union army fighting with one hand tied behind its back. But a lie cannot stop a tidal wave of truth, and the truth was, when given the chance, they would not just fight, they would charge into the very mouth of hell for a nation that had only ever betrayed them, and in doing so, they would redefine the meaning of the war and the soul of America itself. In 1861, the first shots fired at Fort Sumter echoed a clear, if unspoken, policy. This was to be a white man's war. The preservation of the Union was the stated goal, not the abolition of slavery. President Lincoln, navigating a treacherous political landscape, feared that arming black men would push the crucial border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, right into the arms of the Confederacy. The 1792 Militia Act was even cited, a law that explicitly restricted military service to free, able-bodied white male citizens. So while thousands of free black men in the North rushed to enlist, they were turned away. They were offered jobs as cooks, laborers, teamsters, anything but a soldier. Frederick Douglass, the powerful abolitionist voice, was incensed. He argued with thunderous clarity that this was a fatal mistake. This is no time to fight with your white hand and allow your black hand to remain tied, he proclaimed. He saw what the politicians refused to see. The war against the slaveholders' rebellion could not be won without striking at the heart of slavery itself. And the most powerful strike would be to put a rifle in the hands of the enslaved. The shift didn't come from a grand moral proclamation in Washington. It began on the ground with a stubborn Union general and a simple, powerful legal argument. In May 1861, at Fort Monroe, Virginia, 3 enslaved men escaped their Confederate master and sought refuge with General Benjamin Butler. The next day, a Confederate officer appeared under a flag of truce, demanding their return under the Fugitive Slave Act. Butler, a lawyer by trade, refused. His logic was revolutionary. Virginia had seceded, claiming it was a foreign country. Therefore, U.S. federal law like the Fugitive Slave Act no longer applied. Furthermore, since these men were being used to build Confederate defenses, they were contraband of war, just like cannons or mules, and could be seized. The contraband argument spread like wildfire. Soon, thousands of enslaved people were flocking to Union lines, a self-emancipating tide of humanity. They weren't soldiers yet, but they were a massive labor force, weakening the Confederacy from within and forcing the Union's hand. The war was changing, whether Lincoln was ready for it or not. By the summer of 1862, the Union was losing. The war was a bloody, costly stalemate. Lincoln, under immense pressure from abolitionists and facing the grim reality of mountain casualties, made a pivotal decision. After the slim Union victory at Antietam, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was a masterstroke of political and military strategy. It declared that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the rebellious states shall be thenceforward, and forever free. But buried within its text was the clause that would change everything. Such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. This wasn't just a moral document, it was a weapon. It transformed the war's purpose from merely preserving the Union to a crusade for human freedom. And it officially opened the door for the creation of black regiments. The lie that this was a white man's war was officially dead. The floodgates opened. Across the North, free black men enlisted with a passion born of generations of injustice. In the South, formerly enslaved men flocked to Union recruiters, sometimes risking their lives to do so. The Bureau of Colored Troops was established in May 1863 to manage the recruitment and organization of these new soldiers, who would be known as the United States Colored Troops, or USCT. Over 170 regiments were formed. Men like Frederick Douglass's own sons, Charles and Lewis, signed up. The creation of these regiments was an act of profound defiance. For the Confederacy, the sight of a black man in a Union uniform was their worst nightmare made real, a symbol of a world turned upside down. They declared that any black soldier captured would be executed or sold back into slavery, and their white officers would also be executed. This was not a threat, it was a promise. Every man who put on that blue uniform knew he was fighting not just for victory, but for his very survival. They wore the same uniform, carried the same rifle, and faced the same enemy. But they did not receive the same pay. This was the first bitter reality for the soldiers of the USCT. White privates were paid $13 a month, plus a $3.50 clothing allowance. Black soldiers were paid just $10 a month, with $3 deducted for clothing, leaving them with a mere $7. It was a stinging badge of inferiority. The men of the 54th Massachusetts, the famous regiment of free black men, refused to accept any pay at all for over a year, protesting this injustice. Their white commander, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, joined them in their boycott. In South Carolina, Sergeant William Walker of the 3rd SC Colored Infantry was court-martialed and executed for leading his company to stack their arms and refuse duty over the pay issue. This wasn't about greed, it was about respect. It was a fight to be recognized as men and as soldiers, equal in worth and in sacrifice. Finally, in June 1864, after immense political pressure and undeniable proof of the USCT's bravery, Congress passed a bill equalizing the pay and made it retroactive. One of the most persistent myths is that black soldiers were kept away from the front lines, used primarily for manual labor and garrison duty. And it's true, they did perform a disproportionate amount of fatigue duty, digging trenches, hauling supplies, building forts. It was backbreaking, often thankless work, but it was absolutely essential to the Union war effort. General Daniel Ullman himself noted that the amount of fatigue duty performed by the colored troops is almost incredible. However, the idea that this was their only role is a gross distortion of history. From the very beginning, they were hungry for a fight, desperate to prove the doubters wrong. They knew that their freedom and the freedom of their people would not be won with a shovel, but with a bayonet. And when the opportunity came, they seized it with a ferocity that shocked both their allies and their enemies. The first major test came in June 1863 at a dusty, insignificant supply depot in Louisiana called Milliken's Bend. The defenders were mostly newly recruited, barely trained former slaves, armed with old, unreliable muskets. They were attacked by a larger, more experienced Confederate force from Texas. The fighting was savage, devolving into hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and musket butts. The Confederates, enraged at the sight of their former property fighting back, gave no quarter. But the black soldiers did not break. They stood their ground, fighting with what one officer called desperate bravery. Though they suffered heavy casualties, they, along with the help of Union gunboats, repelled the attack. The victory was strategically small, but psychologically immense. It was proof. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was informed of their valor, and even General Ulysses S. Grant, initially skeptical, admitted their performance had changed his mind. The word was out. They could and they would fight. No regiment is more famous than the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. Composed of free black men from across the North and beyond, it was an experiment watched by the entire nation. Their commander was Robert Gould Shaw, a young, idealistic abolitionist from a prominent Boston family. He drilled them relentlessly, forging them into a disciplined, proud fighting force. The 54th was more than just a regiment, it was a symbol. Its success or failure would be seen as a verdict on the capabilities of all black soldiers. They knew this. Frederick Douglass, whose 2 sons served in the 54th, called on them to live up to the high trust committed to your charge. They were determined not just to fight, but to prove to a skeptical world that they were the equals of any soldier of any color on any battlefield. Their moment of truth came on July 18, 1863, on a barren strip of sand in South Carolina. The target was Battery Wagner, a massive Confederate earthwork guarding the entrance to Charleston Harbor. It was a fortress, bristling with cannons and defended by over 1,000 veteran troops. After a grueling day's march and a heavy but ineffective naval bombardment, the 54th was chosen to lead the suicidal frontal assault at dusk. As they formed their lines, Colonel Shaw told his men, "I want you to prove yourselves. The eyes of thousands will be on what you do tonight." They advanced across the narrow beach, the only approach, under a storm of canister and musket fire. The sand churned around them, men falling at every step. But they did not falter. They pressed on into the teeth of the storm, driven by a cause greater than themselves. Colonel Shaw led the charge, sword in hand, shouting, "Forward, 54th!" He reached the parapet of the fort and was shot through the heart, falling among his men. The soldiers of the 54th swarmed over the walls, engaging the Confederates in a brutal hand-to-hand melee inside the fort. They fought for nearly an hour in the darkness and chaos. The flag-bearer was hit, but Sergeant William H. Kearny, himself wounded, seized the colors before they could touch the ground. He planted the flag on the parapet, a defiant symbol amidst the slaughter. When the decimated regiment was finally forced to retreat, Kearny carried the flag back, crawling on his knees, nearly bleeding to death, famously saying, "Boys, the old flag never touched the ground." The assault failed. The 54th suffered nearly 50% casualties, but in their defeat they won a victory more profound than capturing a fort. They had erased all doubt. Their bravery became legendary, a story told in every corner of the Union. Sergeant Kearny would later become the first African American to be awarded the Medal of Honor. If Fort Wagner was a story of heroic sacrifice, the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg, Virginia in July 1864 was a story of valor betrayed by incompetence. The plan was ingenious. Union miners, former coal miners from Pennsylvania, dug a tunnel under a Confederate fort and packed it with 4 tons of gunpowder. A division of United States colored troops under General Edward Ferrero was specially trained to lead the assault. Their mission was to bypass the crater itself, fanning out to the left and right to secure the breach in the Confederate lines. They were drilled, prepared, and ready. But at the last minute, General George Meade, the Union commander, lost his nerve. He feared that if the attack failed, he would be blamed for sacrificing black troops. So he ordered Ferrero's division to be replaced by an untrained, unprepared white division, led by a politically appointed general who was reportedly drunk in a bunker during the attack. The explosion was a terrifying success, blowing a massive hole in the Confederate lines and killing hundreds. But the replacement white division, with no plan, simply charged straight into the crater instead of around it. They became trapped in a giant, chaotic pit, a perfect kill box. The Confederates quickly recovered and surrounded the rim, pouring a merciless fire down on the disorganized Union soldiers. Only then were Ferrero's black troops sent in, not as the spearhead of a breakthrough, but as reinforcements into a hopeless slaughter. They fought with incredible courage, even managing to capture a section of the Confederate trench line beyond the crater, but the attack was doomed. As the Union forces tried to retreat, the Confederates showed particular brutality to the black soldiers. Wounded USCT were bayoneted, and those who tried to surrender were shot down. It was a massacre. The Battle of the Crater was a horrific Union disaster, a failure of leadership that cost thousands of lives. But the bravery of the USCT in that hellish pit was undeniable. By late 1864, the USCT were no longer an experiment. They were seasoned veterans. Their decisive moment came at the Battle of Nashville in December. The Confederate Army of Tennessee under General John Bell Hood was making a desperate last-ditch attempt to reverse the tide of the war. Defending the city was a powerful Union army under General George H. Thomas, an army that included 2 brigades of United States colored troops. On the second day of the battle, Thomas ordered a massive assault on the Confederate left flank. The USCT were part of this charge, tasked with storming a heavily fortified position called Peach Orchard Hill. They advanced under withering fire, their comrades falling around them, but they never wavered. They crashed into the Confederate lines, shattering them completely. Their breakthrough contributed to a total collapse of the Confederate flank, leading to one of the most decisive Union victories of the entire war. The Army of Tennessee was effectively destroyed, and the USCT had been instrumental in its demise. The reality of service for a black soldier went far beyond combat. The myth suggests that once in uniform, the primary difference was the segregation of regiments. The truth was far more complex. Inequality was woven into the fabric of their service. All USCT regiments were commanded by white officers, as it was deemed that black men were not capable of leadership and that white soldiers would refuse to follow them. This created a barrier to promotion and recognition. They were often issued inferior equipment, older smoothbore muskets instead of the newer rifled muskets, shoddy uniforms, and inadequate medical care. Their mortality rate from disease was significantly higher than that of white troops, a direct result of poorer sanitation, diet, and medical attention. They were also assigned the hardest and most dangerous fatigue duties, often in unhealthy, swampy environments. They were fighting 2 wars, one against the Confederates on the battlefield, and another against the prejudice within their own army. The Confederate promise to show no mercy to black troops was not an idle threat. The most infamous example occurred in April 1864 at Fort Pillow, Tennessee. The fort was defended by a mixed garrison of about 600 Union soldiers, roughly half of whom were black. They were attacked by a much larger Confederate force under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, a man who would later become the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. After the Union commander refused to surrender, Forrest's men stormed the fort. What happened next was not a battle, but a massacre. According to eyewitness accounts from Union survivors, soldiers who tried to surrender were shot down or bayoneted. The killing continued long after resistance had ceased. The cry, "No quarter, no quarter," was heard throughout the fort. The massacre at Fort Pillow sent a shockwave through the North and became a rallying cry for black soldiers. "Remember Fort Pillow" became their battle cry, steeling their resolve to fight to the death rather than risk capture and a similar fate. The effectiveness of the USCT created a crisis within the Confederacy. By late 1864, facing catastrophic manpower shortages, a desperate and unthinkable idea began to be debated in the halls of Richmond: arming their own slaves to fight for the South. The irony was staggering. A nation founded on the principle of white supremacy and the institution of slavery was now contemplating putting guns in the hands of the very people it held in bondage. The opposition was fierce. How could they ask a man to fight for a country that enslaved him? As one Georgia politician put it, "If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." But others, like General Robert E. Lee, saw it as a military necessity. He argued that they needed the men and that freedom should be granted to those who served. The debate raged for months, laying bare the central, fatal contradiction of the Confederate cause. Finally, in March 1865, with the Union Army at the gates of Richmond, the Confederate Congress narrowly passed a bill authorizing the enlistment of enslaved men. It was a stunning reversal, an admission of utter desperation, but it was far too little, far too late. The law was vague on the promise of freedom, and the effort to raise these new regiments was chaotic and met with widespread resistance from slaveholders. Only a few small companies were ever raised, and they saw no combat. Just weeks after the bill was passed, the very city where it was debated, Richmond, fell to the Union Army. And in a moment of supreme historical poetry, some of the first Union troops to enter the fallen Confederate capital were men from the United States Colored Troops. They marched through the streets, past the slave auction blocks, as liberators. The contribution of African Americans to the Union victory was not limited to the battlefield. Their knowledge of the Southern terrain, gained through generations of forced labor, was an invaluable intelligence asset. Enslaved people and free blacks acted as spies, scouts, and guides for the Union Army. They provided crucial information on Confederate troop movements, fortifications, and supply depots. The most famous of these was Harriet Tubman, already a legend for her work on the Underground Railroad. During the war, she served the Union as a scout, spy, and even a military leader. In June 1863, she helped guide the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina, a Union operation that liberated more than 750 enslaved people and destroyed Confederate supply lines. This network of intelligence, provided by people who had every reason to see the Confederacy fall, was a secret weapon that is often overlooked. In the final bloody months of the war, the USCT played a critical role in the siege of Petersburg and the fall of Richmond. They were part of the massive Union offensive on April 2, 1865, that finally broke the Confederate defenses after 10 long months. Black regiments were among the first to charge into the captured city of Petersburg. A day later, they marched into Richmond. For the black soldiers, many of whom were former slaves from Virginia, this was the ultimate triumph. They were not just conquerors, they were liberators, marching into the heart of the slave empire that had oppressed their people for centuries. It was a moment of profound, almost unbelievable transformation. The enslaved had become the soldier, and the soldier had become the victor. Abraham Lincoln, the man who had once been so hesitant to arm black men, now saw them as indispensable to the Union's salvation. When he visited the fallen city of Richmond, he was greeted by crowds of cheering, weeping freedmen. In his second inaugural address, just a month before his death, he spoke of the sin of slavery and the terrible justice of the war in language that was almost biblical. And in his final public speech, just days before his assassination, Lincoln did something he had never done before. He publicly endorsed the idea of giving the right to vote to some African Americans, specifically the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. He had seen their sacrifice, their courage, their unwavering loyalty. He understood that their service had not only saved the Union, but it also earned them a claim to American citizenship that could no longer be denied. It was a statement that may have sealed his fate, as John Wilkes Booth was in the audience that night, enraged by the suggestion. The numbers tell a story of their own. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army, making up about 10% of the total force. Another 19,000 served in the Navy. They fought in over 400 battles and skirmishes. Their casualty rate was staggering. Nearly 40,000 died during the war, a mortality rate 35% higher than that of white troops, largely due to the factors of battlefield risks, disease, and inferior medical care. 16 black soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor for their valor. These are not just statistics. They represent a massive infusion of manpower at a critical time when the Union was struggling to fill its ranks. They represent a psychological blow to the Confederacy and a moral boost to the Union cause. To put it simply, it is highly debatable whether the Union could have won the war without their contribution. Their service fundamentally changed the nation. It was a powerful argument for citizenship and civil rights. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship, and the 15th granted black men the right to vote. These were seismic shifts, unimaginable just a few years earlier, and they were paid for in blood by the soldiers of the USCT. During the brief period of Reconstruction, their sacrifice bore fruit as black men voted, held office, and began to build new lives as free citizens. But the struggle was far from over. The promises of Reconstruction were betrayed. A violent wave of white supremacist backlash, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and the implementation of Jim Crow laws would strip away many of those hard-won rights for nearly a century. The new birth of freedom that Lincoln had spoken of would have to be fought for all over again. In the decades that followed the war, as the nation sought to heal its wounds, a new myth was created, the myth of the lost cause. This narrative downplayed the role of slavery and erased the contribution of black soldiers, recasting the war as a noble struggle between white brothers. The story of the USCT was largely forgotten, relegated to a footnote in the history books. Their bravery was ignored, their sacrifices diminished. It took generations of work by historians and activists to bring their story back into the light, to challenge the myths and restore the reality of their central role in the nation's most defining conflict. Monuments were finally built. Their names were finally honored. We are still in the process of remembering, of fully understanding the debt that is owed. The Civil War was many things, but for the men of the United States colored troops, it was a war within a war. They fought against a foreign enemy who sought to keep them in chains. They fought against a domestic prejudice that questioned their humanity. They fought for equal pay, for respect, for the right to even be on the battlefield. And they won. They proved the lie wrong. They demonstrated a courage and patriotism that shamed their detractors. They did not just help save the Union, they forced the Union to become a nation worthy of saving. Their story is not a separate secondary chapter in the Civil War. It is the heart of the story. It is the story of a people who, when given the chance, seized their own freedom with rifle and bayonet, and in doing so, helped liberate America from its original sin. What do you think is the most overlooked aspect of their story? Let us know in the comments below.